My name is Lucas. I'm 24, a college student from Ohio. I recently moved into a shared apartment near my university. My roommate, Eric, seemed like a nice guy, quiet, kept to himself. But there was something off about him. Eric was overly protective of his room. He always locked it when he wasn't home. I thought it was weird, but everyone has their quirks, right? One night, as I was studying late, I heard strange noises coming from his room. They sounded like muffled cries. I couldn't sleep that night. The sounds kept playing in my mind. The next morning, I decided to confront Eric. Over breakfast, I asked, "Hey Eric, did you hear any strange noises last night?" He looked up from his cereal, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No, I didn't." "What kind of noises?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes tense. "Like someone crying. It was coming from your room." Eric laughed, a forced, uneasy sound. "Oh, that? I was just watching a horror movie. You know how loud those can get." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe I was overthinking it. But the thought nagged at me. Over the next week, I noticed more odd things. Eric would come home with heavy bags and rush to his room, locking the door behind him. I wanted to ask him more, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Then, one evening, there was a knock on our door. I opened it to find two police officers standing there. "Is Eric here?" one of them asked. My heart pounded in my chest. "Yeah, he's in his room." "What's going on?" "We need to speak with him," the officer said, stepping inside. They knocked on Eric's door. He opened it, looking surprised but calm. "What's this about?" he asked. "We're investigating a missing person case," the officer explained. "We've traced the last known location to this apartment." Eric's face turned pale. "That's crazy. I don't know anything about that." "Can we check your room?" the officer asked. Eric hesitated, then stepped aside. As the police entered his room, I saw a glimpse of the chaos inside, clothes scattered, a laptop open on the bed. The officers moved to the closet, opening it slowly. I will never forget what I saw next. Inside the closet was a young woman, barely alive, tied up and gagged. Her eyes were wide with terror. My stomach churned, and I felt like I was going to be sick. "Call an ambulance," one of the officers said, his voice steady but urgent. "We've got a live one." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Eric. A kidnapper? It didn't seem real. How had I lived with this monster for so long without knowing? "How could you do this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. Eric didn't answer. He just stood there, his face blank, as the police cuffed him and led him away. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The strange noises, the heavy bags, Eric's locked door. It all made sense now. I had been living with a kidnapper, and I hadn't seen the signs. I couldn't stay in that apartment. The memories were too much. I moved out, trying to put the whole nightmare behind me. But every night, I still hear those muffled cries in my mind, a haunting reminder of the horrors that can hide behind closed doors. My name is Jason, and I'm a 28-year-old graphic designer from California. I recently moved into a new apartment and got a roommate named Mark. Mark worked odd hours and was rarely home. He was polite enough, but something about him seemed off. One evening, I came home to find Mark frantically scrubbing the bathroom floor. The smell of bleach was overpowering. I couldn't help but ask, "What happened in here?" Mark looked up, his face pale and sweaty. "I spilled something," he said quickly, just trying to clean it up. "Why does it smell like bleach?" I pressed. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Just making sure it's clean, you know." I nodded, but something didn't sit right with me. Over the next few days, Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would come home late, looking disheveled and jumpy. I often heard him pacing in his room at night, talking to himself. One night, I was working on a project in the living room when I heard a knock at the door. Opening it, I found 2 police officers standing there. "Is Mark here?" One of them asked. "Yeah, he's in his room." "Is something wrong?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "We need to speak with him," the officer said, stepping inside. They went to Mark's door and knocked. After a moment, Mark opened it, looking startled. "What's this about?" Mark asked, trying to sound calm but failing. "We're investigating a hit-and-run incident," the officer explained. "We've traced the victim's phone to this apartment." Mark's face went white. "I don't know anything about that," he stammered. "Can we check your room?" the officer asked. Mark hesitated, then stepped aside. As the police entered his room, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. There, on his desk, was a phone with a cracked screen. The same phone that had been described in the news reports about the hit-and-run victim. "Is this your phone?" the officer asked Mark. Mark swallowed hard. "No, I found it." The officers exchanged a look. "We need to take you in for questioning," one of them said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. As they led Mark away, I stood there in shock. My mind raced with questions. How had I missed the signs? Was I really living with a fugitive? The next few hours were a blur. The police searched the apartment, looking for evidence. They explained that the victim had been left in critical condition, and Mark had tried to clean up the evidence to avoid getting caught. "How long has he been your roommate?" one of the officers asked me. "About 2 months," I replied, my voice shaky. I had no idea. The officer nodded. "Sometimes, people can hide their true selves very well." I couldn't sleep that night. Every noise made me jump, and I kept replaying everything in my mind. The bleach, the late nights, the phone. It all made sense now. I had been living with a man who had almost killed someone and tried to cover it up. In the days that followed, I moved out of the apartment. I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. The memories were too much. Even now, I still feel a chill when I think about it. I had been living with a fugitive, and I hadn't even known. My name is Kevin, and I'm a 34-year-old bartender from Florida. A few months ago, I moved into an apartment with a quiet guy named Sam. He rarely left his room and was always polite, but never interacted much. I didn't think much of it. People have their own lives, right? One weekend, my girlfriend, Emily, came over to visit. We spent the day together, but when I went to work that evening, she stayed behind to wait for me. When I came back, she was gone. I called and texted her repeatedly, but there was no response. I was distraught, searching everywhere and asking neighbors if they'd seen her. No one had. Days went by, and I was losing my mind with worry. Then, a strange smell started coming from Sam's room. It was faint at first, but grew stronger with each passing day. I decided to confront him about it. "Hey, Sam," I said one evening, knocking on his door. "What's that smell? It's really strong." He opened the door just a crack and smiled. "I'll handle it, Kevin. Don't worry." "But what is it?" I pressed, feeling uneasy. "Just some food that went bad." "I'll clean it up," he replied, still smiling. The smell only worsened. I couldn't take it anymore. One afternoon, when Sam was out, I called the landlord. "There's a terrible smell coming from my roommate's room, and he won't do anything about it," I explained. The landlord agreed to come over. Together, we opened Sam's door. The stench hit us like a wall, almost making me gag. We cautiously stepped inside, and I noticed the room was surprisingly bare, except for the bed. The smell was strongest there. The landlord lifted the mattress, and there, Hidden underneath was Emily's body. She was dead, her face pale and lifeless. I screamed, stumbling back in horror. "Call the police," the landlord said, his voice shaking. I could hardly breathe. My mind was reeling. How could this have happened? How had I been living with a murderer? When the police arrived, they secured the scene and took statements from both me and the landlord. They waited for Sam to return. When he did, he looked as calm as ever. "What's going on?" he asked, seeing the police. "You were under arrest for the murder of Emily," one of the officers said, cuffing him. Sam's smile never wavered. "I knew you'd find out eventually," he said, his tone eerily casual. I felt my world crumble around me. Emily was gone, murdered by the man I'd been sharing my home with. The police took Sam away, and I was left standing in the apartment, numb with shock and grief. In the days that followed, I couldn't stay there. Every corner of the apartment reminded me of Emily and the horror that had unfolded. I moved out, trying to piece my life back together. But even now, I can't shake the image of Sam's smile or the smell that haunted my every waking moment. I had been living with a monster, and I hadn't seen it. How could I have missed the signs? How had I let this happen to Emily? I still ask myself these questions every day, but there are no answers. Just a hollow feeling of loss and a lingering fear that will never go away.